On Saturday, April 23rd of this year, I will be in the Dallas-Fort Worth area for Better Discourse 4. See me and other creators like Blair White, Stephen Destiny Bonnell, James Lindsay, Libby Evans, Carrie Smith, Lisa Reynolds, Nikki Klein, Sean Fitzgerald, and Taba'a. Get your tickets, betterdiscourseevent.com. Greetings and salutations, loyal viewers of this channel. If you're hearing a little bit of offness in my voice, I am currently battling, theoretically, because I took one of those take-home tests, the virus of unknown origins that it is a conspiracy theory to say it originated in a lab in China. So, send your regards, enjoy this video. It may very well be the last, even though this has a 99.9% survival rate, especially for somebody in my age demographic. Be worried for me. It's the end of the world, it's the apocalypse. AJW is down for the count with a slightly stuffy nose from this virus. But before we get into today's topic, which is the potential for nuclear World War III because of NATO, we have to talk about our sponsor, which is actually tied in to the events that are happening in the world. Wow, isn't that clever of Virtual Shield to include this in the ad read? The government is warning right now that we should be on red alert for cyber attacks from Russia, and some of the largest cyber attacks in recent history have been tied back to the Kremlin. This is one of the reasons why, now more than ever, you should be browsing safely and anonymously with Virtual Shield. And guess what? Just for you guys out there in the audience, if you go to virtualshield.com/justice, you can get 50% off your lifetime subscription with the company. That is an amazing deal, and it will help secure your connection, help you browse anonymously, not only avoid the Russian hackers, but avoid all these companies that track your data. Also, if you're into that international streaming, you know, something's region locked, you can get that too from Virtual Shield at virtualshield.com/justice. Secure your online privacy today, virtualshield.com/justice. So as many of you already know, as many of you have already heard, as many of you are already up to date on your news items, Russia has invaded the Ukraine. The invasion of the Ukraine is upon us, and yes, it did in fact happen. Now, I know there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and outright propaganda in the news media, not just on the American side, but what some people forget to mention also on the Russia side heavily, and we're not going to be going over any of those stories. What's happening right now is that we don't really have good verifiable information about the day-to-day events of this war, so I'm not going to bring you stories just to be debunked later. Also, and I will add this because I am a media hater, I have criticized the media for getting information wrong before. It's not 100% their fault that they're getting the information wrong, it's just that verifying your sources is kind of difficult to do in an active war zone. Now, there is a fault in terms of biasy, which is when a story is too good not to report, these people don't bother to fact check it. That definitely exists, but you can't be surprised if information is changing in a developing chaotic situation. So, we're not going to be doing that. I'm not going to be debunking any of that stuff today. You guys have all seen it. Don't believe literally everything you hear from the news media because all this information is subject to change. I just want to talk about the overall attitude surrounding the invasion of the Ukraine by the Russia. Yes, I'm calling it the Russia throughout the course of this video, unless I forget, because there have been a series of terrible takes on the internet.com from both the right and the left. Congratulations, right wing. You're doing pretty terrible when it comes to this topic as well. Now, obviously, one of the funniest takes from one of our best people on the internet.com, Cenk Uygur, was him proclaiming that the reason the right wing is supporting Vladimir Putin is because he is a white authoritarian and race matters far more to everybody on the right wing than anything else. Thus, they love Putin because Putin's white.
He says right wing doesn't love Putin just because he's an authoritarian, tyrannical leader. They love him because he's a white authoritarian leader. Race has become more important than even nationality. They've turned on democracy and now even America in favor of a white warlord.
They are desirous of a white leader who takes charge and is a strong man, and mainly, you remember the right wing never cared about democracy, and they showed it on January 6th, but they've been showing it our whole history. They were like, oh, democracy and equality for black people? No, we're gonna do slavery, then we're gonna do Jim Crow, and we're gonna make sure that they don't have equality for hundreds of years. Who did that? The right wing did that. They've never cared about democracy. They just wanna be in charge. And when they see Vladimir Putin pushing people around, they're like, there's a good white guy pushing people around, not taking any flack, not doing any of this woke nonsense. Go get him, Putin.
And he's killing all of those brown Ukrainians with blonde hair and blue eyes and pale skin because it's Eastern Europe and these are ethnically similar populations. Whatever. Jank was right. All the right wing is racist. The news update that you need to get from all this factual information is that the right wing is in fact racist, and everybody in America that is associated with the right wing also happens to be racist. And by the way, the far left have labeled the Ukrainians neo-Nazis.
Big part of the Ukraine military is neo-Nazis, for real, right? It's called the Azov Battalion is one of them. And I think the number 2 guy in charge in Ukraine is a freaking neo-Nazi. And so they're fighting right over here. Let me just finish this video. And they've been fighting over here since 2015. They've been shelling 14,000 people, and the people here all speak Russian.
Now, President Putin made another big move. He's ordered Russian soldiers to go into the separatist areas. He says they're peacekeepers.
We've been speaking to.
So, has he ordered soldiers into those areas?
There's discussion of it. The Russian Duma has authorized force if necessary, but those photographs were not of any official Russian forces operating within the Donbass region. There is currently no evidence that Russian forces have entered the Donbass region.
So the neo-Nazi Ukraine regime has been shelling and terrorizing those people in Donbass. And so what Putin did was recognize that area as its own separate country now, right? And so that's going to could trigger a war between Russia and Ukraine. They engineered a coup of the democratically elected government in Ukraine and replaced it with a neo-Nazi regime. And I'm not making that up.
So that side of the equation in terms of the right wing, also racist. So we got the more establishment progressive left like Cenk and the further left like Jimmy Dore labeling everybody racist. So we're going to have a great time breaking down this war now that all sides of the war are evil white racists who are both evil, white, and racist. But more fundamentally, rather than go after the left like I typically do on this channel, it's time to talk about the right wing, because there were figures on the right that were basically denying the chance that Vladimir Putin and the Russia would invade the Ukraine. They denied this to the point where there were literal troops on the border and they were saying absolutely no way this was happening. And immediately after the invasion started, all of these people who denied the reality, all of these people who have no context for Russian history at all of a sudden pivoted to, oh, well, the Ukraine isn't worth defending. Oh, the Russians should take it. Honestly, it's NATO's fault that the Russia is invading the Ukraine. Shouldn't we blame NATO? Shouldn't we blame America? So this wasn't happening, according to them. They denied it all the way to the point where there were troops inside the Ukraine, and some of them after, by the way. But then when it did happen, it was the West's fault anyway, and honestly, the Ukraine had it coming. What were they thinking, having such a nice country right on the border of Russia? Now, there is a lot of talk about this forever promise that was made by the United States, by NATO, to the Russians once the Soviet Union fell, about how NATO was never, ever going to encroach on Russian territory. Now, the evidence for this conversation, and I need to point this out because for some reason this myth has just become fact, is discussions between diplomats from the United States, from NATO, and from the Russian government. This was not written down on paper, and as Stephen Michael Davis pointed out brilliantly on Twitter, how all the conversations about broken promises have to do with diplomats having discussions in the 90s, but none of those conversations about broken promises extend to Russia actually violating written agreements about how they're supposed to conduct themselves in the Ukraine. It's almost as if the people who bring up the broken promises already have an agenda that starts off with America bad, and they're just trying to work their way back to the conclusion. And Stephen Michael Davis has talked about this before. There was an agreement during the unification of Germany that America and NATO wouldn't use German unification to get a better position on the Soviet Union. And of course, the Soviet Union ultimately ended up failing.
This claim that promises were broken has gained popularity in the last few years, and we actually know its origins. As Brookings fellow Jamie Kirkchick wrote in National Review, assertions of Western triumphalism with regard to NATO enlargement gained strength in December of 2017, when an outfit called the National Security Archive at George Washington University selectively published a series of recently declassified US government documents purporting to show, once and for all, that Western leaders had indeed offered their Soviet interlocutors a cascade of assurances that NATO would not expand. Despite its official-sounding name, the National Security Archive is a left-wing organization committed to the exposing of Cold War sins, real or alleged, of America through highly selective publishing of tendentiously presented documents. Now, we do know that then Secretary of State James Baker told then Russian President Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. However, that talk, nothing was ever written down or signed, was only made in the context of German reunification. Nations like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia were still part of the Warsaw Pact, and therefore were not even considered during the negotiations. That's why no treaty, accord, or compact was ever signed between Russia and the United States regarding these nations and the future of NATO. As Gorbachev himself said in a 2014 interview with Russia Beyond, the topic of NATO expansion was not discussed at all, and it wasn't brought up in those years. I say this with full responsibility. Not a single Eastern European country raised the issue, not even after the Warsaw Pact ceased to exist in 1991. Western leaders didn't bring it up either. Another issue we brought up was discussed, making sure that NATO's military structures would not advance, and that additional armed forces from the alliance would not be deployed on the territory of the then German Democratic Republic after German reunification. Baker's statement, mentioned in your question, was made in that context.
But somehow this and other diplomatic talks in the later 90s with the Russian Federation are the equivalent of a forever promise that the United States broke, and therefore Russia can just invade its neighbors willy-nilly because America bad isn't America evil. Aren't you against the American empire? America evil, why so America bad, NATO bad? Now, despite the paper trail being relatively clear for people to understand, I actually 100% agree with the people who are blaming NATO, because if you think about the history of Russia and you think about the history of the area surrounding Russia, Russia has no history ever of invading those territories for strategic advantages. There are not literal books written on how Moscow is a vulnerable capital, and it has not been the strategy of Russian regimes, including the Federation, the Soviet Union, all these other different various Russian regimes, of creating buffer states in order to prevent people from marching on Moscow. That has never happened in human history, and NATO, if it did happen at any point in human history, was probably behind that.
Peter Conradi wrote in Who Lost Russia, "Since the 16th century, Russia has been expanding outwards, stopping only when it came up against strong powers, Germany and Austria to the west, China and Japan to the east, and the British Empire to the south."
So NATO is actually this time-traveling organization that historically was infringing on Russian territory all the various times the Russian Empire expanded to all these territories, if you provide me any evidence that Russia ever did that, but I've never seen any of that evidence. There's no books written on the topic. It's not a well-known thing in history. You can't learn it in a basic history of Russia or Europe class. It's just not there. America did it. NATO did it. They're 100% in the wrong. And honestly, NATO, this is just proof that they don't even work. NATO doesn't even work. That's why Russia invaded non-NATO countries, because NATO doesn't work. Yeah, that's what we're gonna go with. Now, obviously, this is ridiculous. Obviously, this is absurd. The reason NATO exists is as a check on Russian aggression, because Russia typically and historically would invade its surrounding areas for buffer states. If you don't know this, if you don't know that this is the intention of every single Russian regime throughout human history, because again, it is strategically advantageous for them to do so, then you're not following your world history very well.
If you're a Russian leader and you're Vladimir Putin, who, by the way, thinks geopolitically in a way that most leaders in the world do not, you know that your country encompasses 11 time zones, but has less people in it than Bangladesh, that it has no natural barriers, very few. It has been invaded not only by the French under Napoleon and the Germans under Hitler, but by the Swedes, the Lithuanians, and the Poles as well. And so you know you need a buffer zone in Central and Eastern Europe. You know you need a buffer zone in the Caucasus. You're terrified of China because you have a 1,000-mile-long border with China. And although you do not want to recreate the Warsaw Pact, after all, Putin knows that it was the expense of keeping up the communist empire that basically destroyed the Soviet Union in the first place. You do want a traditional sphere of influence in Central and Eastern Europe. In other words, The Warsaw Pact may be dead, but Russia is still big. It's right next door. And so the Russian factor still hovers greatly.
Then you're not paying attention. And as for the nations bordering Russia that want to join NATO, why do you think they apply to join NATO? By the way, you actually have to ask to be in NATO. It's not like NATO just annexes you the way it's being portrayed in the media. Estonia, all these other Baltic states, all these states that are around Russia that signed the deal to join in NATO are afraid of exactly what's happening to the Ukraine. And the idea that the Ukraine leading toward maybe joining NATO is somehow justification for Russia invading is also patently absurd on its face. Think about it. If you are afraid of your neighbor who historically invades you, who historically thinks that it owns you, who actually invaded you in 2014 and annexed some of your territory, so you try to join an alliance specifically designed to deter that action from that neighbor, is that then justification to invade you? That's the most absurd thing humanly possible. That's like saying that you are afraid of somebody breaking into your house, so you buy an alarm system. So then the burglar, the person who typically would break into your house, gets offended by that, so they decide to break into your house before the alarm system is installed, but that's really on you, because why were you possibly putting up an alarm system? Why were you taking any precautions to protect your stuff from this historic aggressor? Look, I've talked repeatedly on the internet.com about how having a platform doesn't make you smart, about how making alternative opinions or being right on a lot of issues doesn't make you right on every single issue. This is one of those instances. The idea that in order to own the libs, because Joe Biden is signaling against Russia, because the media had this whole Trump-Russia collusion campaign for years, that we are going to side with the Russians in their territorial advancement, like that's a good thing to happen in the world, is a bit ridiculous. And yes, there are reasons behind Russia doing that. People have this weird idea that if they say, oh, there's a reason Russia did that, therefore it's justified. No, that's not how it works. Just because there are strategic advantages in you invading a territory doesn't make it justified for you to invade that said territory. And there's also the whataboutism people, the people who are like, well, what about the US invading Iraq? Here's a thought for you guys, those whataboutism people. The US shouldn't have invaded Iraq. That was a mistake. That actually weakened our resolve in dealing with this conflict, so just based on that alone, that was a giant mistake. Shouldn't have happened. I was against it. Should not have been done. I was 13 at the time, but trust me, 13-year-old Sean was like, you know what? This is going to create a whole strategic problem with the United States. We should not have invaded Iraq. Total disaster. Not in favor of it. Didn't support it. Are we cool with that? Can I say that I was not in favor of an action of the United States of America, but also point out that this action that's currently going on is not justified based on that? Can I point out that, as Devin Tracy says, two wrongs don't make a who cares? I know that's progressive logic, and a lot of you want to throw that out there, but trust me, yeah, it's not good that the US invaded Iraq, and it's also not good that Russia is invading the Ukraine, because the Ukraine is afraid of Russia invading them, and somehow that's provocation to you out there on the internet.com. Now, that's the faux intellectual criticism of the people who are concerned about the territorial expansion of a geopolitical foe, a historic geopolitical foe of the United States. It actually gets dumber, because a lot of people are pointing out that Vladimir Putin is no friend to the gays. Vladimir Putin not down with the LGBTQ XXIIIIIP community. While on the other hand, while on the flip side of that, if you guys don't know, they actually hang pride flags at US embassies. Right now, I saw a headline of an article that they're going to introduce mandatory pronoun training in the US military. The transes are teaching your kids in the public libraries through their Transes Drag Queen Story Hour readings. Isn't that horrible? Isn't that terrible? That is a problem in this country, so therefore, because Vladimir Putin's not letting that happen in his country, therefore, his invasion of the Ukraine is justified, and if you're against the invasion of the Ukraine, you must be for drag queen transes reading to kids? Is this really the logic that people are going with? Because it actually is. I'm not joking. People are actually sharing this on the right wing, and they're talking about how Vladimir Putin is super base because he doesn't allow this stuff to go on in his country, and here we are having the gender Z people read to our kids. as if these aren't two separate issues, as if these aren't two separate problems, as if we can't say, hey, we should not have this stuff in our schools in America, but also maybe the Russia invading the Ukraine, not the best idea. We can't hold those two thoughts. We just gotta go Putin based because reasons. Real quick, and I'm not gonna make a habit of running 2 ads per video, everybody calm down, but this video is also sponsored by My Patriot Supply. It's an emergency situation. You might want to get some food. If you go to preparewithajw.com, you can get my discounts on emergency food. Always good to have in a pinch. Let's get back to the video. I mean, honestly, I'm struggling with this. If you follow me on Twitter, I've been posting different variants of Russian empires throughout history, so that you can see that these territorial expansions are very common. And by the way, again, they're not for no reason. I know somebody's going to say, oh, I'm a faux intellectual. There's a reason behind that. Yes, Russia has also been invaded a bunch of different times in their history, so they may feel the need to expand. But again, we don't want them to expand. The whole point of American foreign policy post-World War II and post the Cold War is to be the sole superpower, not to let another superpower build themselves up right under our nose and then ultimately end up being dragged into another war that is on the European continent or in the Asian continent, in case we're talking about China. And yeah, that's not what we would want. Also, there's a very important foreign policy implication that a lot of people seem to be glossing over, and this is the idea of nuclear weapons. And no, I'm not talking about the people who basically say, you have to let Vladimir Putin do whatever he wants because Putin has nuclear weapons, and therefore, if you're a nuclear power, you can basically take anything you want as long as you strike first because you have nuclear weapons, and any response to your actions is basically starting nuclear World War III, Holocaust, nuclear winter, we're all gonna die. This is the idea behind the Ukraine and their nuclear weapons, because in the 1990s, Ukraine actually had nuclear weapons. When the Soviet Union fell, they were actually the third most nuclear armed country in the world. They had something like 5,000 nuclear warheads. And there was a theory that the Ukrainian people should, through their government, hold on to these weapons as a hedge against the historic invasions from their Russian neighbor. I know that's crazy. I know that might shock you. I know that it might surprise you that NATO wasn't behind Ukraine worrying about Russia invading them because, you know, NATO causes everything. America causes everything. America's so bad. But this was actually a concern at the time, however conspiratorial and crazy it was for the Ukrainian people and Ukrainian government officials to feel this way at the time. So they were actually convinced by the United States and by the Russian government to not keep those nuclear weapons, to actually turn them over and become a non-nuclear state for the guarantees of security. Now let's think about this for a second. Let's say you're another nation not named Ukraine, who obviously had this invasion coming because NATO and America basically goaded the Russians in there because NATO and America blame America. America bad isn't Putin based. He doesn't have drag queens reading to his children in his schools. Let's say you're just a completely different nation and you are convinced not to hold on to your nuclear arsenal, or somebody's negotiating with you so that you can give up your nuclear program or your nuclear arsenal. And during the course of that negotiation, you are given a bunch of guarantees of security for not remaining a nuclear powered state. When it comes to the point where you want to sign that deal, when it comes to the point where you want to execute this and drop your nuclear program and join the League of Nations or whatever they're calling it now and be in the international community, would you sign that deal based on the example of the Ukraine? Because if the Ukrainians were nuclear power and they pointed all those nuclear weapons at Russia, do you think the Russians would be invading the Ukraine right now? The answer is obviously no. So for those of you who are saying, well, the Ukraine doesn't matter because the Ukraine isn't a historic American ally, which by the way, that's true. The Ukraine is not a historic American ally. It's not our part of the world. Also true. Just remember that the fact that they're getting invaded, and if the Russians ultimately end up winning, actually occurs, then the Ukraine giving up their nuclear warheads during the course of those peace talks is going to be revered as one of the biggest foreign policy blunders in the history of the world. And it's going to make it far more difficult for the United States or anybody who's interested in tamping down nuclear proliferation across the world to do so, because look at the example of the Ukraine. And by the way, we already have one of those examples. We already have a horrible foreign policy blunder, and that is the nation of Libya that gave up the beginnings of their nuclear program, and then the US immediately, when Gaddafi was vulnerable, ended up with a no-fly list over it, and Gaddafi was killed in the streets. By the way, you know why that's relevant? That tape of Muammar Gaddafi being killed in the streets? Apparently that's something that Vladimir Putin watches every single day because he doesn't want to end up like that. So we have a situation where a guy is going up against a non-nuclear power based on guarantees from both sides. I know only forever promises matter from NATO. They don't matter from Russia. They don't matter from the United States to the Ukraine. None of that matters, but only the forever promise from NATO that totally happened. It's totally not diplomats talking, but he's ready to go and he does not want to fall. He does not want to be overthrown. And we're in a crazy situation, all because the American people have lost their moral authority to call out nonsense in the world. Now, I know a lot of people in the comments in the live chat, if I'm premiering this, are going to say, blah, 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 Russia, blah, 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 you're biased for America, blah, 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 America's no angel either. Look at this random historical event that I think ties in and makes a much better point than I think I'm actually making. And you know what? I'm going to say it. I am biased for the United States. I want America to be the 800-pound gorilla in the room on the global stage. I want my nation to be the sole superpower in the world. That is my position, that's my perspective, and I believe it is the moral authority, or the United States has the moral authority to check against historic aggressors in order to maintain some modicum of peace in the world. Look, I'm perfectly willing to have discussions about where America is at fault or whatever. Those are interesting conversations that I'm not denying have some validity, but overall, and I've referenced this essay multiple different times, this demoralization, this delegitimization of America on the world stage in the hearts and minds of the American people has consequences. In France, during World War I, these people were some of the biggest die-hard, fight-to-the-last-man people that you could possibly be. And this had a huge impact. The French lost more people in World War I than all Americans died in all the American wars combined. And this left a scar on their nation. And one of the ways that they responded to this is they became incredibly war-weary. Instead of talking about the brave patriots that fought for France on behalf of World War I, they started equivocating them with their German counterparts, started painting soldiers more as victims, started saying if there were heroes, then there were heroic people on the German side and the French side, that honestly, people were just fighting for their country, and each person's reason for fighting and each nation's reason for fighting were equally as valid as the other, and there was no moral superiority of French society. So then World War II rolls around, and after decades of propaganda of the youth that would become the generation that would be in the army for France to fight in World War II, the Germans took over France in about 6 weeks. 6 weeks. This is the effect of a demoralized population. This is the effect of losing your will to fight. This is the effect of not believing your nation is worth fighting for. And I don't want this to happen in the United States of America. Everybody in the right talks about how we're getting demoralized. Everybody on the right talks about how they're trying to undercut the foundation of the United States for this global narrative. What is more in line with the global narrative than talking about how the Russians are just like us, and honestly, we can't pass moral judgment? Or this ridiculous ideology that permeates throughout the left and throughout all of our pop culture, that all cultures are equal, yet somehow the West is worse than all those other cultures. Every culture is valid and they all have their valid decisions, except for the West. The West is always the source of every problem. And you know who's the leader of the West? The United States. So America is the source for every problem. If you don't believe that the United States of America or Western countries, Western values as a whole are superior, that they are worth fighting for, that they aren't evil, racist, or imperialistic, or all this nonsense that gets thrown upon them, and they're just the equivalent of Russian values, what the Russians stand for, how are we ever going to overcome any challenge in the future? How is our nation going to stand up to nations like Russia? How are you not just as demoralized as the plebs, as the sheep, as the cattle, whatever you want to call them, that you're constantly complaining about? You gotta stand for something, you gotta believe in something, and believing in your nation is one of those things that is key to your success. It does have an impact, it does have an effect, it does matter. So maybe you're not too concerned about the Ukraine. It's a world away, and honestly, the consequences aren't clear and apparent, but this attitude in the United States of America needs to be fixed really quickly. The idea that we're just going to be able to flip a switch once the real war comes along is nonsensical. The idea that having this attitude is not going to ultimately lead to that real war that we're supposedly going to flip a switch for is crazy. You need to get on the right page. You need to set aside your petty differences. You need to not be pro-Russia to own Joe Biden. You need to stop obsessing about this dude not being able to pronounce Ukrainian in his State of the Union like that matters.
Putin may circle Kyiv with tanks, but he'll never gain the hearts and souls of the Iranian people. He'll never extinguish their love of freedom.
Your people are just as embarrassing as those who obsessed over Trump saying Tim Apple.
And we're going to be opening up the labor forces because we have to. We have so many companies coming in. People like Tim, you're expanding all over and doing things that I really wanted you to do right from the beginning. I used to say, Tim, you got to start doing it over here, and you really have. I mean, you've really put a big investment in our country. We appreciate it very much, Tim Apple.
About the CEO of Apple, like Apple was his actual last name. Calm down, let's focus, let's talk about what matters, and let's have reasonable conversations about foreign policy. But hey, look, those are just my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you believe that the Russia has never once invaded its neighbors for any reason at all whatsoever, and there's nothing to NATO being a strategic response to that, let me know in the comments. If you think America bad, let me know in the comments. If you think that honestly Vladimir Putin is the coolest guy ever because he don't have pride parades, then also let me know in the comments. I want to hear all that nonsense. If you like the video, you can show me by leaving a like. You can subscribe for more content. You can follow me on all my social medias. You can support me via the support links in the description box of this video. This has been me talking about Russia in the Ukraine, insane in the Ukraine. Till next time.